In the quiet neighborhood of Willow Creek, where change rarely knocked and routines were sacred, Margaret Cooper lived a life of order and solitude. For over 3 decades, she had watched over her community like a silent guardian, ensuring everything remained as it had always been. But all of that begins to shift when a new neighbor, David Harris, and his spirited daughter, Lily, move into the house across the street. At first, Margaret sees them as intruders disrupting her carefully controlled world. Suspicion clouds her judgment, leading her to a choice. She soon regrets a choice that sets the wheels of change in motion. What begins as mistrust soon unravels into something far more meaningful as Margaret finds herself drawn into an unexpected friendship. Small gestures of kindness, shared moments, and a community project reveal truths Margaret has long buried and challenge her to confront the walls she has built around herself. But can a woman so set in her ways truly open her heart to change? And what will happen when an entire neighborhood comes together to rediscover the value of connection and unity? Willow Creek had always been Margaret Cooper's sanctuary. Nestled among towering oak trees and winding streets, it was a neighborhood that seemed frozen in time. The houses were elegant and orderly, their manicured lawns adorned with vibrant flowers. Margaret had lived there for over 3 decades in her pristine white house, a modest 2-story home with a garden she tended to with great care. At 56 years old, Margaret's life was built on routine. She woke up at sunrise, brewed a cup of chamomile tea, and sat on her garden bench to read her favorite novels. The quiet hum of the neighborhood brought her peace. Occasionally, neighbors passed by and offered a polite wave or a brief conversation about the weather, but Margaret liked keeping to herself. She saw herself as a steward of Willow Creek, a watchful eye ensuring the harmony of the place she called home. That morning was no different. Margaret took her seat in the garden, surrounded by neatly pruned rose bushes and the gentle chirping of sparrows. A soft breeze rustled the pages of her book, but the calm was soon disrupted by the sound of an unfamiliar engine. Margaret looked up, squinting at the sunlight as a large white moving truck crawled slowly down the street. It came to a stop directly in front of the vacant house across from hers. Margaret's heart skipped a beat. The house had been emptying for months after the previous owner moved to be closer to her family. Margaret had grown used to its stillness, the curtains drawn, and the lawn untended. Now, watching the movers unload heavy boxes and furniture, Margaret felt an unease settle in her chest. She set her book down and stood, her gaze fixed on the scene unfolding. A sleek black SUV pulled up behind the truck, its windows tinted. Margaret's brows furrowed as the driver's door opened, and a tall man stepped out. He was dressed sharply in dark trousers and a crisp white shirt, sleeves rolled up to his elbows. His movements were confident and deliberate, as though he belonged exactly where he was. Margaret instinctively folded her arms across her chest, a frown tugging at her lips. Something about him unsettled her. She had grown cautious of strangers over the years. Experience had taught her that change often brought chaos, and the man across the street felt like change personified. Margaret lingered at the edge of her garden, pretending to adjust a rose bush as she watched the movers carry heavy furniture into the house. A large, elegant leather couch, tall wooden crates, even a grand black piano. Who needs such extravagant things? She thought to herself, unease morphing into suspicion. Minutes passed before Margaret saw the man pause to direct the movers. His voice carried across the street firm yet calm. She could not hear the words, but the way he commanded attention irked her. She imagined he was the sort of man who gave orders without bothering to ask questions. "Good morning, Margaret," a familiar voice interrupted. Startled, Margaret turned to see Elaine Walker, her friend of many years, walking up the garden path with a warm smile. Elaine was a widow like Margaret, though far more sociable. She carried a plate of apple pie wrapped in foil. "I thought I'd bring you a treat," Elaine said cheerfully, her gaze following Margaret's. "What are you staring at?" Margaret sighed, brushing invisible dirt from her gardening gloves. "The house across the street. Someone's moving in." Elaine glanced over, her expression curious, but not concerned. "Well, it is about time. It has been emptying for too long." Margaret pursed her lips. Yes, but who moves in without notifying the neighborhood? No introductions, no courtesy. That man, she trailed off, shaking her head. Elaine chuckled, amused by Margaret's intensity. You cannot judge someone before you know them. Maybe he's just busy settling in. Margaret folded her arms again. Or maybe he's hiding something. Elaine sighed, placing the pie on Margaret's garden table. You know, Margaret, not everyone is out to disrupt Willow Creek. You need to give people a chance. Margaret shook her head. You were not here when the Peterson family moved in years ago. Loud music, unruly children. It disrupted everything. They left, and it took months to restore the peace. Elaine waved a dismissive hand. That was a long time ago. Things are different now. But Margaret could not shake the unease. She watched as the movers carried in a large wooden crate. It took 2 men to haul it inside, their movements careful as though the contents were precious or dangerous. I'm going to keep an eye on things, Margaret muttered. Elaine shook her head with a smile, gathering her empty plate. Suit yourself, but do not let your imagination run wild. Call me if you want company later. After Elaine left, Margaret went inside, her unease growing with every glance at the house across the street. She drew her living room curtains just enough to give herself a clear view of the activity outside. From the window, Margaret spotted the man step out of his SUV again. This time, he carried a large black bag over his shoulder. His movements were smooth, efficient, almost too composed. He walked into the house, disappearing behind the door. Margaret's mind raced with questions. What is in the crates? Why so many boxes? She could not suppress the gnawing suspicion that something was not right. Retrieving an old pair of binoculars from a drawer, Margaret sat by the window, peering through the lenses for a closer look. She watched as movers unloaded what looked like tools and metal equipment. Her imagination spiraled. Tools or weapons? She wondered, her pulse quickening. She set the binoculars down and paced the room, her nerves fraying. Margaret prided herself on being the unofficial protector of Willow Creek. Her neighbors trusted her instincts, and she took that responsibility seriously. As evening fell, Margaret sat on her porch, pretending to sip her tea as her eyes remained fixed on the house across the street. The moving truck had left, and the lights in the house were now on. Through the windows, Margaret could see shadows moving, boxes being unpacked, furniture being arranged. The man emerged onto his porch, phone in hand, talking in a calm, low voice. His silhouette against the light cast long shadows across the front yard. Margaret's hands tightened around her teacup. She could not understand why his presence unsettled her so much. It was not just his confidence, it was the fact that he seemed so out of place. Willow Creek had always been predictable, and Margaret clung to that predictability like a life raft. Why did no one tell me someone was moving in? She thought bitterly. Why does he need such a large house all to himself? A nagging thought crossed her mind. Should she call the police? It felt drastic, but her instinct screamed that something was off. Margaret paced her living room, weighing her options. The man had done nothing wrong, not yet, but her anxiety gnawed at her, refusing to let her rest. Finally, unable to silence her unease, Margaret picked up the phone and dialed. Maple County Police Department. How can I assist you? A calm voice answered. Margaret hesitated, clutching the phone tightly. Yes, this is Margaret Cooper of Willow Creek. I would like to report some suspicious activity in my neighborhood. The dispatcher asked for details, and Margaret did her best to explain without sounding overly paranoid. A man just moved in across the street. He brought in crates, large boxes. I do not know what is inside, but he is acting strange. I do not think he belongs here. The dispatcher's voice remained professional. All right, ma'am. We will send an officer to check it out. Margaret hung up, her heart pounding. She sat by the window again, waiting for the police to arrive. In her mind, she justified her actions. I am protecting the neighborhood, she told herself. It is my duty. Across the street, the lights in the man's house glowed warmly against the darkening sky. Margaret could see him sitting on his couch, a book in hand, seemingly at peace. For a moment, a pang of doubt crossed her mind. What if I am wrong? She wondered. What if he is just another neighbor looking for a fresh start? But it was too late to take back the call. Margaret turned away from the window, unaware that the events of the night would set her life and the neighborhood on an unexpected path. The evening air in Willow Creek was thick with silence, broken only by the faint chirp of crickets and the rustle of wind through the towering oaks. Margaret Cooper sat in her armchair near the living room window, her hands trembling slightly as she sipped her now lukewarm tea. Her eyes flickered nervously across the street, where the lights in the stranger's house still glowed brightly. A subtle unease gnawed at her. The man had been too calm, when she observed him through her binoculars. He had shown no sign of wrongdoing, but Margaret's instincts refused to be quieted. For decades, she had watched over Willow Creek like a quiet guardian. If something was off, she had always acted. And tonight she had. A faint hum in the distance made her heart jump. She leaned closer to the window, squinting into the night. Moments later, the steady pulse of headlights crept around the bend, and a police cruiser rolled slowly up to the curb in front of the stranger's house. Margaret felt a mix of relief and dread settle in her chest. They will sort it out, she thought, wrapping her cardigan tightly around her shoulders as though bracing for a cold wind. Two officers emerged from the cruiser. Margaret recognized one of them as Officer Daniel Grady, a tall, broad-shouldered man with salt and pepper hair. He had been with the department for years, occasionally stopping by neighborhood meetings to reassure residents that Willow Creek was one of the safest places in the county. The second officer was younger, likely new to the force. Margaret watched them approach the house, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. Her gaze darted toward the front door, where the man she now knew as David Harris emerged, holding his hands casually in his pockets. He wore a dark blue sweater and simple jeans, nothing flashy or alarming. His calm demeanor under the beam of their flashlights made Margaret's pulse quicken. From her window, she could see David's mouth moving as he spoke to the officers. They seemed relaxed as they listened, occasionally glancing around at the neatly arranged boxes visible through the window. David gestured toward his house with an air of explanation, not defensiveness. Margaret gripped her teacup tightly, frustration bubbling in her chest. Why are they just standing there? She wondered, why aren't they asking him more questions? After several minutes of conversation, one officer nodded politely and turned back toward the patrol car. David stood on his porch, arms crossed, watching them leave. Margaret sat frozen in disbelief as the officers returned to their car, their shoulders relaxed and movements unhurried. The police cruiser rolled away, its red taillights glowing like fading embers until it disappeared down the street. The stranger David stood still for a moment before glancing briefly across the road toward Margaret's house. Even from a distance, Margaret could sense his calm, yet purposeful gaze, as though he knew exactly who had made the call. Without a word, David turned, stepped inside, and shut the door quietly behind him. Margaret let out a shaky breath, setting her teacup down with a soft clink. The quiet of her living room suddenly felt oppressive, as though the walls themselves were pressing in on her. The following morning brought a golden glow to Willow Creek. The sky was clear, and the neighborhood looked as picturesque as ever. Margaret, however, felt anything but calm. She had hardly slept, her thoughts racing back to the events of the previous night. She kept herself busy that morning, pruning her roses and sweeping fallen leaves from the porch, but her mind was restless. She wondered what the officers had thought, what David had thought about the call. Did they believe I overreacted? Margaret had just finished sweeping when the sound of footsteps on her walkway startled her. She looked up to find David Harris approaching her porch, holding a small potted plant in his hands. He wore the same calm expression as the day before, though there was something firm in the way he carried himself. "Good morning, Mrs. Cooper," he said, his voice low and warm. "I hope I am not disturbing you." Margaret froze, gripping the handle of her broom. "Oh no, I was just tidying up," she replied, her voice higher pitched than usual. David stepped onto the first stair of her porch, holding the potted lavender plant out toward her. "I thought I would bring you this as a way to say hello. I noticed you take good care of your garden, so I thought it might fit right in." Margaret stared at the plant, her face flushing with a mixture of surprise and guilt. She blinked at the small lavender blooms nestled in the pot's rich soil, feeling completely unprepared for this unexpected kindness. "Thank you," she stammered, carefully setting the broom aside to accept the plant. "That's very thoughtful of you." David smiled faintly, his gaze steady but not unkind. "I figured I should introduce myself properly. I am David Harris. My daughter Lily and I just moved here." Margaret nodded slowly, clutching the plant like it was an anchor. "It is nice to meet you, Mr. Harris. I am Margaret Cooper. I have lived here for a long time." "I can tell," David said, glancing at her meticulously maintained garden and neatly painted house. "It is clear how much you care about this neighborhood." His words were kind, but Margaret's stomach twisted. Does he know I called the police? Is this his way of confronting me? Before Margaret could respond, David continued, "You know, Mrs. Cooper, I understand how a new neighbor can cause some concern. Change can be hard." Margaret looked up sharply, but David's expression remained open and calm. "I hope you will find that Lily and I will fit in just fine here," he added. "Willow Creek seems like a wonderful place to build a home." Margaret's guilt flared again, this time accompanied by a quiet shame that pressed heavily on her chest. David was being kind, gracious, even despite what had happened the night before. She knew she had misjudged him, yet she could not bring herself to acknowledge it out loud. "That is good to hear," Margaret managed, her voice soft. "Willow Creek has always been a peaceful place." David nodded, offering a polite smile. "That is what I am hoping for." With that, he stepped back off the porch. "If you ever need anything, my door is open. I hope we can all get to know each other better over time." Margaret could only nod as he turned and walked back across the street. She watched him disappear into his house, her mind a whirl of thoughts. She looked down at the lavender plant in her hands, its soft purple blooms swaying gently in the breeze. It had been such a small gesture, unexpected kindness in its simplest form, but it left Margaret feeling completely unmoored. As the day stretched on, Margaret found herself staring at the lavender plant she had placed on the edge of her garden. Its presence seemed to taunt her, reminding her of how quick she had been to judge David Harris. Later that afternoon, Elaine stopped by again, her usual cheery demeanor lighting up Margaret's kitchen as they shared a pot of tea. "You look like you have seen a ghost," Elaine teased as she stirred a spoonful of honey into her cup. "What is on your mind?" Margaret sighed, glancing out the window at David's house. "He came by this morning, David Harris. He brought me a lavender plant." Elaine raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised. "That was kind of him." Margaret nodded slowly, her face clouded with unease. "It was kind, but it felt undeserved. I called the police last night, Elaine." Elaine's spoon froze mid-stir. "You did what?" "I thought something was wrong," Margaret admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "But now I realize I was wrong about him. He was so calm, so polite. I do not know what to think anymore." Elaine set her cup down gently, giving Margaret a thoughtful look. "Maybe it is time you give him the chance he deserves." Margaret remained quiet, her thoughts churning. Outside, the lavender plant swayed gently in the wind, its small blooms whispering of something Margaret had not felt in a long time. Regret. Margaret sat on her porch that evening, the air cooling as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm, golden glow over Willow Creek. The small lavender plant sat neatly by her feet, its delicate purple flowers swaying in the breeze. It had been hours since David Harris had left it for her, yet Margaret still found herself unable to shake the feeling it had stirred inside her. Why had he been so kind? The act was small but felt monumental, especially after what she had done. He had every reason to be upset, yet he had come to her doorstep with flowers and kindness. Margaret sipped her tea, which had long gone cold, and glanced across the street at David's house. The soft yellow glow from his living room window painted a picture of quiet contentment. For the first time, she noticed how neatly he had arranged his front yard. There was order to it, intention. A modest flower bed had been planted, and a small row of solar lanterns lined his walkway. He cares, Margaret realized, the thought surprising her. Her gaze shifted to a silhouette in the window. She could see him moving, likely arranging boxes or furniture. Margaret imagined how overwhelming it must be to start fresh in a new place, especially with a young child. Lily, she recalled, David had mentioned his daughter's name earlier that morning. The pang of guilt in her chest deepened. Evening, Margaret. Margaret jumped slightly, startled by the cheerful voice of Elaine Walker, who was walking her beagle, Daisy, down the sidewalk. Elaine waved with one hand, holding Daisy's leash with the other. You look like you've seen a ghost. Are you still worrying about the new neighbor? Margaret forced a smile, though it felt tight. No, I'm just thinking. Elaine grinned knowingly as she paused at the bottom of Margaret's steps. Thinking about how nice he is, I hope. I heard about the lavender plant. That was thoughtful of him. Margaret nodded stiffly, not wanting to elaborate. Maybe it's time you let yourself see the good in him, Elaine added, her voice gentle. Willow Creek could use a little change every now and then. You know, people like David might surprise you. Margaret offered a polite goodbye, but Elaine's words lingered as the older woman strolled down the street. A little change, Margaret repeated silently to herself. Could she allow herself to believe that David Harris was a positive one? The following morning, Margaret found herself restless. She stood at the kitchen window, clutching her coffee cup as she gazed across the street at David's house. It was early, and the neighborhood was still cloaked in quiet. Then, she saw David emerging from his front door, a tool belt slung over his shoulder. He stepped onto his porch and waved to someone walking by, his smile easy and genuine. Margaret furrowed her brow as he bent down to inspect his front gate. One of the hinges looked loose, and David seemed to notice, fiddling with it briefly before heading toward his SUV. Margaret's eyes darted to the lavender plant sitting on her windowsill. Something about the sight of it stirred her to act, even if she was unsure why. Without allowing herself to overthink, Margaret grabbed her gardening gloves, tucked a small packet of seeds into her apron, and stepped outside. The crunch of gravel under her shoes was the only sound as she crossed the street. It felt strange, almost foreign, to step out of her predictable routine and walk to David's house. Her heart thudded in her chest, her pride whispering that she did not need to do this. But another voice, the quieter one, urged her forward. David had just opened the back of his SUV when he looked up and noticed her approaching. His brows lifted slightly in surprise, but he quickly smiled. "Good morning, Mrs. Cooper." "Good morning," Margaret replied, her voice more clipped than she intended. She paused at the edge of his driveway, fiddling with the seed packet in her hands. I noticed you have been working on your garden." David's expression softened, as though he knew how much effort it had taken for her to come over. "Trying to, at least," he said lightly, gesturing toward the small flower bed by his porch. "I am not much of a gardener, but Lily insists on having flowers." Margaret nodded and held out the seed packet. "I thought you might like these. They're zinnias, easy to grow and resilient." David accepted the seeds, his smile broad and genuine. "Thank you. That's very kind of you." For a moment, Margaret did not know what to say. She glanced toward his flower bed, where a few unevenly planted blooms poked out from the soil. "If you need any tips, I will have spent years tending to my garden." David chuckled softly. "I might take you up on that. It seems like you've got the greenest thumb in Willow Creek." Margaret felt a faint flush on her cheeks at the compliment. She cleared her throat and looked toward the loose hinge on his gate. "That hinge looks like it needs fixing." David followed her gaze and nodded. "It does. I was planning on getting to it today, but there's always something else to do." Margaret hesitated before speaking. "If you need a hand, I have tools." I can help." David looked at her for a long moment, something unreadable in his gaze. Finally, he smiled again, softer this time. "I would appreciate that." The rest of the morning passed quietly as Margaret worked alongside David. She brought over her toolbox, and together they fixed the broken hinge on his gate. Margaret had expected awkwardness, but to her surprise, the work passed easily. David was patient and quick to laugh, making light of their slow progress. "You are surprisingly handy," Margaret remarked as David tightened the final screw. He grinned. "I had to be. My wife was the gardener, and I was the handyman. After she passed, I tried to do both, though I'm clearly better at fixing gates than planting flowers." Margaret glanced at him, startled by the admission. David's tone was matter-of-fact, but there was a shadow behind his eyes, grief, well-worn but still present. "I am sorry," she said quietly. David paused for a moment before nodding. "Thank you." It's been 2 years, but Lily and I are finding our way. Margaret's chest tightened. The thought of a man raising his daughter alone, while carrying his own loss, struck a chord deep within her. She remembered her own grief when her husband passed away years ago. It had been a quiet, suffocating pain, made worse by her isolation. "I imagine she is very proud of you," Margaret said, surprising herself. David's smile returned, softer now. "I hope so." By the time they finished, the morning sun was high, casting long shadows across the neatly mended gate. David wiped his hands on a rag and turned to Margaret. "Thank you, Mrs. Cooper. I would not have finished this so quickly without your help." "It was nothing," Margaret replied, though she felt lighter than she had in days. She hesitated before adding, "If you need help with the flowers, well, I'm usually in my garden most mornings." David's eyes crinkled warmly at the corners. "I will let Lily know. She will be thrilled to have your expertise." Margaret turned to head back across the street, her heart feeling strangely full. The air seemed fresher, the sunlight brighter, as though a small weight had been lifted from her shoulders. As she reached her porch, she looked back to see David kneeling by the flower bed, carefully pressing the packet of zinnias seeds into the soil. The sight brought a small smile to her face. For the first time, Margaret allowed herself to hope that change perhaps was not always something to fear. The next morning brought with it a stillness Margaret Cooper had not felt in years. For the first time in what seemed like forever, she found herself sipping her tea not out of habit, but out of a quiet contentment she could not quite explain. Outside her window, the neighborhood was bathed in a soft golden light, and Willow Creek looked as serene as it always had. Yet, to Margaret it felt slightly different, warmer perhaps. Her gaze drifted to David Harris's house across the street. The newly fixed gate swung smoothly now as David stepped through it, carrying a watering can. He knelt by his flower bed where the zinnias Margaret had given him were planted, and she noticed the care he took as he gently watered each spot of soil. Margaret allowed a small smile to tug at the corners of her mouth. He was really trying to make a home here. She had to admit that to herself now. Setting her teacup down, Margaret felt an urge to check on her own garden. Slipping on her gloves, she stepped outside and began pulling a few weeds from her rose bushes, though her eyes strayed toward David's house more often than she cared to admit. "Good morning, Mrs. Cooper." The cheerful voice startled her, and Margaret straightened up quickly, brushing the soil from her gloves. Turning, she saw Lily Harris trotting across the street toward her, clutching a small, crumpled piece of paper in one hand and wearing a bright smile. Behind her, David stood by his porch, watching with an amused expression. "Good morning, Lily," Margaret said, her tone measured but not unkind. Lily stopped at the edge of Margaret's garden, holding out the paper excitedly. "Look, I made this for you." Margaret hesitated, then removed her gloves to take the paper. It was a drawing, one that only a child could create, with colorful flowers sprouting from a garden. In the center of the picture stood a small figure wearing a sun hat. Margaret squinted at it, her lips twitching into a smile. "That is me, isn't it?" Lily beamed and nodded eagerly. "Yes. Dad says you're really good at growing flowers, so I drew you in your garden." Margaret's heart warmed at the innocent gesture. She looked up to see David smiling faintly from across the street, his hands resting casually on his hips. "It's lovely, Lily," Margaret said softly. "Thank you." Lily grinned, her excitement bubbling over. "Daddy said you might help us with our flowers. Can you show me how to plant roses?" "I love roses." Margaret blinked, taken aback. "Roses? Well, they can be tricky." Before she could finish, David walked over, his steps relaxed but purposeful. "I hope Lily hasn't been bothering you too much, Mrs. Cooper," he said gently, though there was humor in his voice. "She hasn't," Margaret replied quickly, glancing down at Lily's expectant face. David crouched beside his daughter, one hand resting lightly on her shoulder. "She's been talking about your garden non-stop since yesterday. It seems you've made quite an impression." Margaret looked down at the drawing again, feeling a strange mixture of flattery and discomfort. Her garden had always been a solitary pursuit, a place of control and familiarity, but Lily's enthusiasm was contagious. "Well," Margaret said slowly, meeting David's gaze, If you're serious about planting roses, I suppose I could show you how to get started. Lily let out a squeal of delight, and David's smile widened. That would be wonderful. Thank you, Mrs. Cooper. Margaret cleared her throat, feeling slightly flustered by their gratitude. Tomorrow morning, then, I'll bring some supplies. The following day, Margaret arrived at David's house with a small crate of gardening tools and a few cuttings from her own rose bushes. She knocked softly, and David answered almost immediately, smiling warmly. Right on time, he said. Come on in. Lily's been waiting for you all morning. Margaret hesitated for only a moment before stepping inside. The house, she noted, was coming together nicely. The walls were adorned with framed family photos, and though a few boxes remained scattered about, the living room already felt lived and comfortable warm. Lily bounced into the room, her energy infectious. Miss Margaret, I'm ready. David chuckled. Lily, let's give Mrs. Cooper a moment to breathe. Margaret waved off the comment, already feeling herself soften toward the girl's enthusiasm. It's all right. Let's head outside. The three of them stepped into the front yard, where the modest flower bed waited. Margaret knelt in the soil, showing Lily how to dig proper holes for the rose cuttings. Lily listened intently, her small hands eagerly mimicking Margaret's careful movements. David worked alongside them, handling the heavier tasks, carrying soil, watering the freshly planted roses, and occasionally cracking jokes that made Lily giggle and Margaret smirk despite herself. As they worked, Margaret couldn't help but notice the ease with which David interacted with his daughter. He was patient and attentive, always ready with an encouraging word or a gentle correction when Lily made a mistake. It reminded Margaret of her late husband, Harold, and the way he used to teach her nieces when they visited in the summers long ago. You're very good with her, Margaret remarked quietly as she handed David a trowel. David looked up, his expression softening. I try my best. She's been through a lot these past couple of years. Margaret nodded, sensing the weight behind his words. It's not easy, raising a child on your own. David paused for a moment, his gaze thoughtful. No, it's not. But she's resilient. Kids have a way of showing us strength we don't always see in ourselves. Margaret absorbed his words, feeling them settle deep within her. She glanced at Lily, who was carefully patting soil around a rose cutting, her face scrunched in concentration. Resilient, that was the right word. For the first time in years, Margaret felt a flicker of something she could not quite name. It was not just admiration for David or affection for Lily, it was something deeper, something she had not felt since Harold had passed. A sense of purpose, of connection. By the time they finished, the flower bed had been transformed. The rose cuttings stood in neat rows, their stems sturdy and hopeful. Lily clapped her hands, beaming up at Margaret. Thank you, Miss Margaret. They're so pretty. They'll be even prettier once they bloom, Margaret replied, a rare smile crossing her face. David stood, brushing the dirt from his hands. You've worked your magic, Mrs. Cooper. Thank you again for taking the time. It was no trouble, Margaret said, though the words felt inadequate. She looked down at Lily, who was wiping her soil-streaked hands on her overalls, her grin still bright. Take care of those roses, Lily. They'll need your attention. I will, Lily promised, bouncing on her heels. As Margaret gathered her tools and turned to leave, David called after her. Would you like to stay for lunch? It's the least we can do. Margaret hesitated, caught off guard by the offer. The polite answer would have been no. She had lived alone for so long that sharing meals felt unnatural. Yet, as she looked back at David and Lily, something in her heart shifted. Thank you, she said slowly. I would like that. Later, as the three of them sat around a modest kitchen table eating grilled cheese sandwiches and tomato soup, Margaret felt a strange warmth settle over her. Lily chatted happily about school and her favorite books, while David chimed in with dry humor that made Margaret chuckle despite herself. It was a simple moment, so simple that Margaret might have dismissed it entirely in the past, but it felt significant. She had stepped out of her comfort zone, and in return, she had found herself in good company. As Margaret left later that afternoon, David walked her to the door. Thank you again, Mrs. Cooper. Lily, and I really appreciate everything. Margaret turned to look at him, holding her gardening crate close. "It's Margaret," she said softly. "You can call me Margaret." David's smile was genuine, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "Thank you, Margaret." As she walked back to her house, Margaret glanced over her shoulder to see Lily waving enthusiastically from the window. The sight made her heart swell. Maybe change is not so bad after all, she thought, her steps lighter than they had been in years. The next morning, Margaret Cooper woke earlier than usual. The house was quiet, filled only with the faint sounds of birds chirping outside her window. Sunlight filtered through her neatly drawn curtains, spreading a golden warmth across her tidy living room. Sitting with her usual cup of chamomile tea, Margaret found herself staring at the small lavender plant David Harris had given her, now settled on her windowsill. Its delicate purple flowers caught the light just right, their color vibrant and alive. It had been days since David and Lily moved in, but something had undeniably changed in Margaret's heart. She set her teacup down and allowed herself a small, thoughtful smile. Helping David and Lily with their rose garden had been surprisingly pleasant. Margaret could not remember the last time she had spent time with anyone like that, working side by side, sharing small conversation, hearing a child's laughter ring through the air. It felt like something she had forgotten she missed. Still, Margaret was not entirely sure how to move forward. The boundaries she had placed between herself and the world were not easy to dismantle. She had spent years building them, years convincing herself that isolation was safety and control was comfort. Letting someone in, even in the smallest way, was unsettling. Just then, a soft knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. Margaret blinked and glanced at the clock. It was barely 9. Who would be calling so early? With slight hesitation, she made her way to the door and opened it to find Lily Harris standing on her porch. Her face lit up instantly when she saw Margaret, her braided hair slightly tousled from the morning wind. In her hands, she held a small pitcher of lemonade and 2 glasses carefully balanced on a wooden tray. "Good morning, Miss Margaret," Lily chirped, her voice bright. "Daddy and I made lemonade, and I wanted to share some with you." Margaret stared at the girl, momentarily caught off guard by the sweetness of the gesture. Behind Lily, she spotted David standing on his porch across the street, watching them with a faint smile and a wave. Margaret's heart softened a little more. "Well," she said, clearing her throat, "that is very thoughtful of you, Lily." She stepped back slightly, holding the door open. "Would you like to come in?" Lily's face brightened further, and she nodded eagerly. "Yes, please." Margaret guided Lily to her kitchen table, where the girl carefully set down the tray and poured lemonade into 2 glasses with the focus and care of someone completing a very important task. Margaret watched her, amused despite herself, as Lily handed her one of the glasses. "Thank you," Margaret said, taking a cautious sip. The lemonade was tangy and sweet, clearly made with fresh lemons. "This is quite good. Did you make it yourself?" "Daddy helped," Lily said proudly, swinging her legs back and forth under the chair. "We make lemonade together every summer. He says it's a tradition." Margaret's lips quirked into a small smile. "Traditions are important." Lily nodded vigorously. "Daddy says they remind us of what matters most, like family and friends and helping neighbors." Margaret paused mid-sip, Lily's words landing heavier than they should have. "Your father is a very wise man," she said quietly, glancing toward the window where David was now tending to their front yard. "Yeah," Lily said matter-of-factly, her smile softening. "He always says that when we're kind to others, it makes the world feel a little smaller and a little happier." Margaret felt something shift inside her at the girl's innocent declaration. For so long, she had chosen caution over connection, isolation over vulnerability. And yet here was this child, so open, so sure of the goodness in others. Before Margaret could respond, Lily jumped up, her energy bubbling over. "Can I see your garden, Miss Margaret? Daddy says it's the prettiest in the whole neighborhood." Margaret blinked, slightly flustered by the sudden request. "Well, I suppose it wouldn't hurt to show you," she said hesitantly, rising from her chair. Lily clapped her hands together and beamed. "Yay! I love flowers." Out in the garden, the morning sunlight illuminated the roses, lilies, and hydrangeas that Margaret had so carefully nurtured over the years. The air was rich with the smell of soil and blooming flowers, and Lily darted from one plant to the next, exclaiming excitedly at the colors and shapes. "This is beautiful, Miss Margaret," Lily said, crouching to examine a cluster of bright pink roses. "Daddy and I are going to plant so many flowers like these." Margaret stood back, watching the girl with a faint smile. "It takes a lot of patience to grow a garden like this," she said. "You have to tend to it every day, rain or shine." "I'll take care of ours," Lily said earnestly, looking up at Margaret. "You can teach me, right?" Margaret hesitated for only a moment before nodding. "I suppose I can." Lily's face lit up with joy, and she spun around to face the street. "Daddy, come look at Miss Margaret's garden." David had been kneeling near his front yard, pulling weeds. At Lily's call, he looked up and waved before standing and making his way over. He carried a warm, easy smile, though Margaret still felt slightly self-conscious as he approached. "Morning, Margaret," David greeted as he joined them, his hands stuffed into his pockets. Lily wasn't exaggerating. "Your garden is incredible." "Thank you," Margaret replied, glancing down to hide the flush of pride she felt. "It's taken years to get it just right." David looked around at the vibrant plants, nodding appreciatively. I think gardening says a lot about a person," he said thoughtfully. "It takes patience, dedication, and care. It's clear you put your heart into this." Margaret looked up sharply, startled by his words. "I suppose it does," she said softly, the hint of a smile returning. David met her gaze and gestured toward her garden with a faint grin. "You might regret offering to teach Lily, though. She's persistent once she sets her mind on something." Lily giggled from where she crouched, carefully touching the petals of a bright yellow daffodil. "It's because I want our flowers to be pretty like Miss Margaret's." David chuckled, shaking his head. "See what I mean?" Margaret could not help but smile as she watched the father and daughter interact. The ease between them, the quiet, genuine bond reminded her of things she had long forgotten. A pang of something close to longing tugged at her heart, but she pushed it aside. "Well," she said briskly, straightening her posture, "I will bring over a few more rose cuttings later this week. You'll need to care for them properly if you want them to grow." "Thank you," David said sincerely, his gaze steady. "We really appreciate it." Lily stood and bounded over to her father, her small hand slipping into his. "Daddy, can we plant more flowers today?" "Please." David smiled down at her. "Maybe later, kiddo. Let's not wear Miss Margaret out." Margaret shook her head, her tone softer now. "It's no trouble. I enjoy being in the garden." Lily grinned up at her. "You're the best gardener ever, Miss Margaret." Margaret chuckled softly, the words warming her more than she cared to admit. "We'll see about that once your garden starts growing." David placed a gentle hand on Lily's shoulder, steering her back toward their house. "We'll see you soon, Margaret," he said with a smile. As Margaret watched them cross the street, something settled quietly in her heart. For so long, she had resisted change, resisted connection. But here they were, a man and his daughter, offering her simple, unexpected kindness. Turning back to her roses, Margaret knelt in the soil, the sun warming her back as she gently pruned a cluster of buds. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to believe that change might not only be inevitable, it might be exactly what she needed. The afternoon sun hung lazily over Willow Creek, draping the neighborhood in soft golden light. Margaret Cooper stood by her kitchen counter, her fingers trailing absently along the rim of the small ceramic teacup in her hands. From her window, she could see the Harris house across the street. The porch was decorated modestly, with a few strings of small lights twinkling faintly even in the daylight. Balloons in shades of pale blue and yellow were tied neatly to the railings, their gentle sway adding an unexpected charm to the scene. Margaret frowned at the invitation on her kitchen table. "Join us for a small gathering. Refreshments, smiles, and good company. Let's get to know each other. Everyone welcome. Sincerely, the Harris family." The handwritten note was short and simple, tucked inside her mailbox that morning. At first glance, Margaret had been surprised. Willow Creek rarely hosted such events, and for David, Harris knew, as he was to plan something like this, spoke to his confidence, to his eagerness to integrate. Still, Margaret's first instinct had been to decline. What would I even do there? She thought. Stand around, sipping lemonade, trying to make polite conversation. But as the hours passed, Margaret found herself unable to ignore the faint tug in her chest. In the last few days, David and Lily had extended nothing but kindness to her. David's patience and Lily's enthusiasm had chipped away at the barriers she had so carefully built. She glanced at the invitation again. Perhaps it was time she returned the gesture. By late afternoon, the sound of laughter drifted across the street, carried by the light breeze. Margaret peeked through her living room curtains and spotted a small crowd beginning to gather outside the Harris house. Elaine Walker, ever the social butterfly, was already there, chatting animatedly with Jessica and Paul Brown, a younger couple who lived just a few doors down. Margaret recognized a few other familiar faces too: Mr. Thompson, the elderly gentleman whose fence David had repaired, and the Johnson family, their 2 young children running happily in circles near the front porch. It looked nice. With a deep breath and a quiet mutter to herself, Margaret grabbed her light cardigan and stepped outside, shutting her front door softly behind her. The walk across the street felt strangely significant, as though she were stepping out of one version of herself and into something new. As Margaret approached, Lily Harris was the first to spot her. The little girl let out a delighted gasp and darted toward her. "Miss Margaret, you came." Margaret paused, surprised by the warmth in her greeting. "Well, I couldn't very well turn down an invitation. Now could I?" she said lightly. Lily beamed and grabbed Margaret's hand, tugging her gently toward the porch. "Daddy, Miss Margaret's here." David appeared from the crowd, his smile bright and easy as he approached. He wore a simple button-down shirt with the sleeves rolled up, looking every bit the gracious host. "Margaret," he said warmly, extending a hand. "I'm so glad you decided to join us." Margaret shook his hand briefly, feeling oddly self-conscious. "Well, I thought it might be time to meet a few neighbors properly." David nodded, clearly appreciative. "That's the spirit. Please make yourself at home. We got lemonade, iced tea, and snacks. Lily insisted on baking cookies, so I apologize in advance if they're a little crunchy." "Daddy," Lily huffed, crossing her arms with an exaggerated pout. David grinned and winked at Margaret. "Go on, Lily. Why don't you show Miss Margaret where the cookies are?" "Come with me," Lily chirped, tugging Margaret toward a small table set up near the porch steps. It was covered with trays of cookies, sliced fruit, and sandwiches. A large pitcher of lemonade sat in the center, its sides coated with beads of condensation. Margaret glanced around as neighbors mingled, talking in small groups with easy smiles and laughter. She felt slightly out of place, but for the first time it was not an unpleasant feeling. Instead, it was refreshing. "Try one," Lily urged, holding out a cookie with an expectant grin. Margaret took it hesitantly, biting into the slightly overbaked edges. "It's delicious," she said, not entirely untruthfully. Lily beamed, her satisfaction evident. "See? I told Daddy I'm a great baker." "Indeed you are," Margaret replied, allowing a rare chuckle to escape. Over the next hour, Margaret found herself loosening, her shoulders no longer tense as they usually were at gatherings like this. Elaine Walker waved her over, and soon Margaret was engaged in a lively conversation with a small group of neighbors, discussing everything from the weather to the history of Willow Creek. Every now and then, Margaret's gaze drifted to David, who moved effortlessly among the crowd, chatting with everyone. He was natural calm, approachable, someone who seemed to belong wherever he stood. Watching him, Margaret felt a pang of guilt once more at how she had misjudged him. "He's something, isn't he?" Elaine's voice broke into Margaret's thoughts. The older woman smiled knowingly, sipping her lemonade as she followed Margaret's gaze. "Who?" Margaret replied, though she knew exactly what Elaine meant. "David, of course. A good man. It's been a long time since anyone brought the neighborhood together like this." Margaret nodded slowly. "He certainly seems to know how to make people feel welcome." "And what about you?" Elaine prodded gently. "How are you finding all of this?" Margaret glanced around. Children played tag on the grass. Neighbors shared quiet laughs, and the faint hum of conversation blended harmoniously with the rustle of the wind. For once, she did not feel like an outsider looking in. "I think," Margaret said carefully, "that this might be just what Willow Creek needed." Elaine's smile widened. And maybe it's just what you needed, too. Margaret did not reply, but deep down, she knew Elaine was right. As the gathering stretched into the early evening, David made his way to the center of the yard and clapped his hands lightly to get everyone's attention. The crowd quieted, all eyes turning to him. "Thank you all for coming today," David began, his voice carrying with ease. "When Lily and I moved here, we hoped to find a place where we could feel at home, a community where we could belong. I can already see that Willow Creek is exactly that." There were murmurs of agreement and a few scattered claps. "I know change can sometimes be hard," David continued, his gaze sweeping across the crowd. "But it can also bring good things, new connections, fresh starts. Lily and I are so grateful for the warm welcome we've received, and I hope we can return the favor." Margaret watched him closely, his words resonating more deeply than she expected. Change had never been something she welcomed. It had always felt like a disruption, a loss of control. Yet, as she looked around at her neighbors laughing, smiling, connecting, she realized that David had brought something vital to Willow Creek. He had brought people together. As the gathering wound down and neighbors began to say their goodbyes, Margaret lingered near the edge of the yard, watching Lily chase fireflies in the dimming light. David approached her quietly, a glass of lemonade in his hand. "Did you enjoy yourself?" Margaret turned to him, offering a small, genuine smile. "I did. You've done something remarkable here, David." He shrugged lightly, though his smile was warm. "I just wanted to meet my neighbors. I think it's important for us all to feel connected." Margaret nodded, her gaze softening. "You're right. It is." David studied her for a moment, his expression thoughtful. "You know, Margaret, sometimes it just takes a little kindness to change the way we see things." Margaret looked away, feeling an odd tightness in her chest. Maybe so. As she made her way home later that evening, Margaret paused on her porch, taking in the quiet of Willow Creek. From across the street, David's house glowed warmly, its porch lights illuminating the small balloons still tied to the railing. Margaret let out a slow breath, feeling something shift inside her, a softening, a quiet acknowledgement that perhaps change was not so frightening after all. For the first time in years, she felt something she had long thought forgotten: hope. The morning after David's gathering, Willow Creek seemed to carry a different energy. Margaret Cooper stood on her porch, her hands wrapped around her cup of tea, watching as the neighborhood seemed to stir with quiet life. There was something new in the air, an undercurrent of warmth, as if invisible barriers had started to break down. The sound of laughter floated faintly across the street, pulling Margaret's gaze to David Harris's house. There he was, kneeling in his front yard beside Lily, who was covered in soil, her small hands digging eagerly in the dirt. David appeared to be explaining something, his voice calm and patient as he gestured toward the flower bed. Margaret found herself smiling faintly, resilient, just like the zinnias she thought. As she took a sip of tea, the calm was suddenly disrupted by a sharp gust of wind. It rolled through Willow Creek like a wave, shaking the old oak trees and rattling fences. Margaret instinctively glanced around, and that was when she saw it. Her wooden trellis, the one that supported her climbing roses, had split near the base. "Oh no," she muttered, setting her cup down on the railing and rushing into the yard. The trellis leaned precariously, the weight of the thick rose vines pulling it further to one side. Margaret grasped it with both hands, trying to steady it, but the wood creaked dangerously. She knew she could not repair it on her own. From across the street, David's voice called out, "Margaret, everything all right?" Margaret looked up to see him approaching, his strides purposeful. Lily trailed behind, her hands still smudged with soil. "I'm fine," Margaret stammered, though she clearly was not. "The trellis, it's giving way." David stopped beside her, assessing the situation. "Looks like the wind got the best of it." He crouched and placed a hand on the wood, giving it a gentle push to test its strength. "It's cracked near the bottom. Do you have any tools in the house?" Margaret blinked, thrown off balance. "Well, yes, but I couldn't ask you to." "You didn't ask," David replied simply, flashing a small, reassuring smile. "Let me take a look. It'll be quick." Before Margaret could argue further, David had already crossed the yard and returned with her toolbox. She watched as he set to work with practiced hands, pulling the trellis upright and carefully bracing it with a temporary support. Lily crouched nearby, humming quietly to herself as she examined the roses, her enthusiasm undeterred by the moment's chaos. Margaret stood back, awkwardly holding her gardening gloves as she watched David work. "You didn't have to do this," she said finally, her voice quieter. David glanced up, wiping his forehead with the back of his hand. "It's no trouble, Margaret. That's what neighbors do, lend a hand when it's needed." Margaret shifted uncomfortably, not used to being on the receiving end of such kindness. "I've managed fine on my own for a long time." David paused, meeting her gaze with a knowing look. "I don't doubt that. But even the strongest people need help sometimes." Margaret opened her mouth to respond, but found no words. There was truth in what he said, though it sat heavy in her chest, pressing against walls she had carefully built over the years. By late morning, David had secured the trellis back in place, strengthening the base with screws and gently untangling the climbing roses. Lily, meanwhile, had been carefully gathering fallen petals, collecting them like small treasures in the pocket of her overalls. "That should hold for a while," David said, brushing his hands off as he stood. "You might want to replace the trellis before the next storm, though. It's getting old." Margaret nodded, inspecting his work. It was solid, neat, better than she could have managed on her own. "Thank you," she said, her voice quiet but sincere. David smiled, his expression open and kind. "Anytime." Lily popped up beside him, her pocket bulging with petals. "Look, Miss Margaret, I saved the pretty ones." Margaret couldn't help but chuckle at the girl's earnestness. "Those are lovely, Lily. What are you going to do with them?" Lily thought for a moment, her brow furrowing with concentration. "Maybe I'll make a picture with them, like I did with the flowers in your garden." David grinned down at his daughter. "That sounds like a great idea, kiddo. Maybe you can give it to Miss Margaret when it's done." Lily's face lit up with excitement. "Yes, I will." Margaret felt her heart soften further, though she struggled to put words to the feeling. It had been so long since anyone had simply shown up, no questions, no conditions, just to help her. Watching David and Lily walk back across the street, she found herself lingering at the edge of her garden, the repaired trellis standing tall behind her. Even the strongest people need help sometimes. The words echoed in her mind, carrying with them a truth she had ignored for years. That afternoon, Margaret busied herself baking. It had been ages since she had used her kitchen for anything other than simple meals, but something about David's unexpected kindness pushed her to repay it. She moved with focus, kneading dough and slicing apples, the familiar rhythm of baking soothing her restless thoughts. By the time the pie was in the oven, the house smelled of cinnamon and butter, warm, inviting. When the pie had cooled enough to carry, Margaret carefully packed it into a tin and slipped on her cardigan. Crossing the street felt strangely momentous again, though this time, her steps were lighter. David answered the door quickly, surprise flickering across his face when he saw her. "Margaret," he said, his brow lifting. "Is everything all right?" Margaret held out the tin with a small, reserved smile. "I baked a pie. Apple. It's my way of saying thank you for earlier." David blinked. Then his face broke into a broad smile. "You didn't have to do that, but thank you." "That's very kind. Just trying to be a good neighbor," Margaret replied, a hint of humor softening her tone. David stepped aside. "Would you like to come in for a bit?" Lily's in the living room working on her picture. Margaret hesitated for only a moment before nodding. "All right, but just for a little while." The living room felt cozy, bathed in soft afternoon light. Margaret sat on the edge of the couch, her hands folded neatly in her lap as David poured tea and placed 2 mugs on the coffee table. Across the room, Lily was sprawled out on a rug, carefully arranging the rose petals she had collected earlier into the shape of a heart on a piece of construction paper. "That looks beautiful, Lily," Margaret said, genuinely impressed. Lily beamed up at her. "It's for you, Miss Margaret. I'll give it to you tomorrow when it's finished." Margaret's chest tightened at the girl's innocent sweetness. She glanced at David, who was watching his daughter with quiet pride. "You've done well with her," Margaret said softly, surprising herself. David looked over at her, his smile gentle. "Thank you. She's a good kid, stronger than I am most days." Margaret nodded, her gaze lingering on the girl who had so easily brightened her days. For so long, Margaret had assumed that opening her heart to others would only bring pain, but David and Lily were slowly teaching her otherwise. You know, David said after a pause, kindness has a way of coming back to us when we least expect it. Margaret turned to look at him, something in his words stirring deeply within her. Maybe you're right, she replied quietly, taking a sip of tea. And for the first time in years, Margaret felt a flicker of hope that she was no longer as alone as she had once believed. The days after David fixed Margaret's trellis seemed to flow by with a quiet ease that Margaret had not felt in years. Her mornings had taken on a new rhythm, one she had not realized she needed. She woke with purpose, tending her garden not just for herself, but with the thought of passing on her knowledge to Lily. Occasionally, she would glance across the street and see David or Lily waving, which brought a small but sincere smile to her lips. It was a Thursday morning when Margaret's phone rang, pulling her from her thoughts. She had just returned from watering her roses and sat down with a fresh cup of tea when the landline, an old relic, she had never quite given up, buzzed to life. "Hello," she answered, holding the receiver close to her ear. "Margaret? It's Susan." Margaret's eyebrows lifted slightly at the voice of her younger cousin. Susan lived 2 states away and called sporadically, usually on holidays or birthdays. "Well, this is a surprise," Margaret said, leaning back in her chair. "How have you been?" "Oh, we're doing fine," Susan replied quickly, her voice carrying the casual energy of someone with a purpose. "But I've been meaning to call you about something." Margaret frowned faintly, waiting as Susan continued. "You know we have that little guest cottage in the back of our house," Susan said brightly. "John and I were talking, and we thought you might want to come stay with us. You know, move closer to family." Margaret's breath caught slightly, her fingers curling around the edge of the table. "Move?" "Yes," Susan said cheerfully. "You've been in Willow Creek for so long, and I just worry about you being all alone. It would be nice to have you nearby, closer to family. John and I could help with anything you need, and you wouldn't have to do everything yourself anymore." Margaret was quiet for a moment, the suggestion sinking in like a stone in water. She had never considered leaving Willow Creek before. The thought of moving somewhere unfamiliar to a guest cottage no less filled her with an unexpected unease. "I don't know, Susan," she replied slowly. "That's a big change." "I know it is," Susan said, her voice softening. "But think about it, Margaret. You'd have company. You wouldn't have to worry about fixing fences or tending a big garden all by yourself. And Lily and John's boys would adore having you here. It's not healthy to be so isolated." Margaret swallowed, her throat suddenly dry. "I appreciate the offer, Susan. Let me think about it." "All right," Susan replied, a hint of hope in her voice. "Just promise me you will think about it." "I will," Margaret said, though her tone was faint. "Goodbye, Susan." As she set the phone back on its base, Margaret felt an unfamiliar heaviness settle over her. Moving closer to family made sense, of course. It was practical, but as she looked out her window and saw the sunlight glancing off David's house, something inside her resisted the thought. That afternoon, Margaret found herself sitting on the bench in her garden, the trellis David had repaired standing sturdy behind her. She let her gaze wander across the street, where David and Lily were working in their flower bed again. The zinnias she had given them were beginning to sprout, small green shoots reaching up toward the light. "Margaret?" The voice startled her, and she looked up to see David approaching, a watering can dangling from his hand. "Afternoon," he said with an easy smile. "I was just checking on the flowers, and Lily wanted me to bring this to you." He handed her a piece of construction paper with a neatly arranged heart, made of pressed rose petals glued to it. Margaret blinked, staring at the handmade creation. "This is very sweet." "Lily wanted you to have it," David said, his smile soft. "She calls it her thank you gift." Margaret felt something shift in her chest, something warm and unfamiliar. "She's a thoughtful girl." David nodded, his expression thoughtful as he sat down on the edge of Margaret's porch steps. "She gets that from her mom." For a moment, they sat quietly, the hum of Willow Creek filling the space between them. Margaret hesitated, then spoke, her voice quieter than before. "My cousin called this morning. She wants me to move closer to her. Live with family." David turned his head slightly, studying her. "And what do you think about that?" I don't know, Margaret admitted, folding the paper carefully in her lap. It would be practical. I'd have help with things. I wouldn't be alone. David nodded, choosing his words carefully. Sometimes practical doesn't mean right. What feels right to you? Margaret let out a soft breath, her gaze wandering to her garden. Willow Creek has been my home for so long. I know every corner of it, every neighbor, even the ones I don't talk to. It's familiar, but sometimes I wonder if that's enough anymore. David's gaze was steady, kind. It's not easy to figure out where we belong. I moved here for a fresh start after my wife passed away, and for a long time, I wasn't sure it was the right choice. But then I realized something. Margaret looked at him, waiting. Home isn't just a place, David said quietly. It's the people you choose to share it with. The ones who show up, even when you least expect it. Margaret felt her throat tighten at his words. She looked down at the handmade heart in her lap, the petals Lily had so carefully pressed into place. Lily and I would miss you, David added softly. And I think you'd miss Willow Creek more than you realize. Margaret swallowed hard, caught off guard by how much his words moved her. She had spent so many years keeping people at arm's length, convincing herself that loneliness was the price of stability. But now, as she sat there with David, the truth began to dawn on her. She was not alone anymore. She had neighbors who waved from across the street. She had a little girl who brought her drawings and smiled as though Margaret were her favorite person in the world. And she had David, who showed up with kindness when she least expected it. That evening, Margaret sat by her window, watching as twilight settled over Willow Creek. The soft glow of porch lights illuminated the street, and from across the way, she saw Lily standing by their front yard, pointing excitedly at the zinnia sprouts. David knelt beside her, his patient voice carrying faintly on the breeze. Margaret could not hear his words, but she could see the smile on his face, the way he ruffled Lily's hair affectionately. Home isn't just a place, Margaret thought, remembering his words. The phone call from Susan lingered in her mind, but the thought of leaving Willow Creek no longer felt right. The idea of starting over somewhere else, somewhere far from the people who had quietly begun to change her life, felt hollow. As darkness fell and the neighborhood grew quiet, Margaret stood up and opened her front door. She stepped onto her porch and took a deep breath, letting the cool evening air settle around her. Across the street, David turned and saw her. He waved, and she lifted her hand in return. Tomorrow, she thought, she would call Susan back and thank her for the offer. But she would tell her no. She was staying in Willow Creek. The next morning, Margaret woke with a sense of clarity she had not felt in years. The decision to stay in Willow Creek settled in her chest like a deep breath, steady and calming. As sunlight poured through her bedroom window, she felt the faintest tug of anticipation, something she had forgotten existed. After a quick breakfast, Margaret dialed her cousin Susan's number. The call was brief, but the resolution in Margaret's voice surprised even herself. "Susan, I'm grateful for your offer," she said firmly, yet kindly, as she sat by her kitchen window. "But Willow Creek is my home. I have neighbors here, people I care about. I'm not ready to leave." There was a brief pause before Susan replied softly, "I understand, Margaret. Just know the offer stands if you ever change your mind." "Thank you," Margaret said, a quiet smile on her face as she hung up. Setting the phone down, she looked out toward David's house across the street. The sight of him and Lily moving about their yard brought warmth to her heart. They had shown her something she did not know she needed: connection. Later that morning, Margaret was in her garden when she heard footsteps approaching. Looking up, she saw David making his way across the street, carrying a weathered wooden box under one arm and holding Lily's hand with the other. Lily skipped happily alongside him, her curls bouncing with each step. "Morning, Margaret," David called cheerfully. "Good morning," Margaret replied, standing and brushing the soil off her gloves. "What brings you two over here?" "We have a little something for you," David said, setting the wooden box down on the edge of her garden. "Lily and I thought it was time to give back a little after all you've done for us." Margaret raised an eyebrow, curious as she knelt to open the box. Inside, she found a small selection of gardening supplies: new trowels, a pair of sturdy gloves, and several packets of flower seeds. She traced her fingers over the labels: marigolds, daisies, sunflowers. It's just a small thank you, David said, his voice warm, for helping us with the roses, for showing Lily so much patience. She insisted we include sunflowers because, according to her, everyone needs something cheerful in their yard. Margaret turned to Lily, who was beaming brightly. "They're my favorite," the little girl exclaimed. Margaret felt something catch in her throat as she looked at the carefully chosen gifts. This is very thoughtful," she said softly, unable to hide how touched she was. "You didn't have to do this." "We wanted to," David replied simply. Lily crouched beside her, tugging gently on Margaret's sleeve. "Will you plant the sunflowers, Miss Margaret? I want to see them grow big and tall." Margaret chuckled, the sound feeling lighter than usual. "Yes, Lily, I'll plant them, and you can come over and check on them anytime you like." Lily clapped her hands excitedly and ran over to chase a butterfly flitting near the roses. David stood watching her, a small smile on his face, before turning back to Margaret. "I had an idea I wanted to run by you," he said casually, but there was a hint of eagerness in his tone. Margaret stood, folding her gloves neatly in her hands. "Oh, what sort of idea?" "I was thinking about the little park at the end of the street," David said, nodding toward the far corner of Willow Creek. "It's looking a bit neglected, broken benches, weeds taking over. I thought maybe we could organize a neighborhood cleanup day. Get everyone involved. Maybe plant some flowers and fix things up." Margaret tilted her head, studying him. "A cleanup day?" "Yes," David said. "It could be good for the community. Bring people together. And Lily's been asking for a place where she and the other kids can play safely." Margaret's gaze drifted toward the park. She had passed it nearly every day for years, but had hardly paid it any attention. The once vibrant little space had faded, its charm overshadowed by chipped paint, cracked pathways, and overgrown grass. "A fresh start," she murmured, mostly to herself. "Exactly," David said, his eyes brightening. "I know you care about Willow Creek as much as anyone. You've been its quiet guardian for years. I thought maybe you could help me get the word out." Margaret looked at him, surprised by his words. "I suppose I have," she admitted slowly, feeling the weight of the truth in what he said. For so long, she had believed her role was to watch and protect, keeping change at bay, ensuring things stayed as they were. But now, for the first time, Margaret realized that protecting her community did not mean clinging to the past. Sometimes it meant helping it grow. Margaret took a deep breath, a decision settling in her mind. "I'll help," she said finally, meeting David's gaze. "It's a good idea. We'll get the neighborhood together and see what we can do." David's smile widened. "I knew I could count on you, Margaret." Margaret allowed herself a small smile in return. "We'll need a list of who can help, what supplies we'll need: paint, tools, flowers." "Already ahead of you," David said, holding up a small notebook he had tucked in his pocket. "I'll handle the supplies. You can talk to the neighbors. People trust you. Margaret, you've been here longer than anyone." Margaret was startled by his words, but there was no denying the truth in them. People did trust her. For years, they had looked to her as the steady presence of Willow Creek. Perhaps now, she could use that trust to bring people together. Over the next few days, Margaret threw herself into the preparations. She visited neighbors she had not spoken to in years, explaining David's plan for the park and asking for their help. To her surprise, the response was overwhelmingly positive. "I think it's a wonderful idea," Elaine Walker said when Margaret stopped by one afternoon. "It's about time we put some love back into that park." Jessica and Paul Brown offered to donate paint for the benches, while Mr. Thompson volunteered to bring tools. Families with children signed up eagerly, thrilled at the idea of creating a space where kids could play safely again. Each evening, Margaret would return home feeling both tired and fulfilled, her heart lighter with each new yes she received. She had spent so many years seeing change as a threat, but now she could feel a change was exactly what Willow Creek needed. The night before the cleanup day, Margaret stood in her garden, looking across the street at David's house. The lights inside glowed warmly, and she could see Lily bouncing around in the living room, her energy seemingly endless. Margaret's gaze drifted to the small wooden box David had given her, sitting beside the trellis he had repaired. She thought of the seeds inside, tiny, fragile things that held the promise of something beautiful. Sometimes all it takes is a little care, she thought. For the first time in years, Margaret felt at peace. She no longer saw herself as a woman clinging to the past, but as someone who could help bring something new to life. The seeds of change had been planted, and tomorrow, they would begin to grow. The morning of the cleanup day arrived with a soft golden glow spreading across Willow Creek. Margaret Cooper stood on her porch, hands resting on her hips, surveying the street with quiet pride. For the first time in years, the neighborhood felt alive, buzzing with energy and purpose. She could see people gathering at the little park down the street, holding tools, bags of soil, paint cans, and baskets of flowers. Laughter echoed faintly, and the hum of conversation drifted through the air. Margaret turned back inside to grab her gardening gloves and a freshly baked batch of oatmeal cookies she had prepared the night before. It had been years since she had baked for anyone other than herself, but this morning it felt right necessary even. When she stepped back outside, she saw David Harris and Lily making their way toward her house. David balancing a toolbox in one hand while Lily carried a small watering can and a bright pink chalk set. "Morning, Margaret," David called with a cheerful wave. Lily bounced ahead, her face alight with excitement. "Miss Margaret, we're fixing the park today. It's going to be so pretty." Margaret smiled warmly. "It certainly will be, Lily. You brought chalk, I see." "Yup, I'm going to draw flowers on the path, so everyone will see how pretty it is," Lily said, beaming. David chuckled as he reached Margaret's steps, his easy smile ever present. "We're glad to have you leading the charge today, Margaret. Everyone's ready to get to work." Margaret nodded, her heart swelling at the thought. For so many years, she had seen herself as separate, watching, not participating. But today, that changed. Today, she was part of something bigger than herself. "Well," she said, picking up the tin of cookies, "we better get to it then. There's work to be done." The park, once a neglected patch of land at the corner of Willow Creek, was buzzing with activity. Neighbors of all ages, families, couples, children, and even older residents like Mr. Thompson were busy restoring it to its former beauty. Paintbrushes dipped into fresh coats of yellow and blue, bringing new life to the old benches. Flower beds were being dug, ready for marigolds and daisies. Kids laughed as they carried small watering cans, eager to help in any way they could. Margaret found herself working side by side with David and a few other neighbors, clearing weeds and preparing the soil for new flowers. It was hard work, but the camaraderie made it easier. "I can't remember the last time I saw this park full of people," Elaine Walker said, crouching beside Margaret to plant a row of bright yellow marigolds. "It's like the whole neighborhood's woken up." Margaret nodded, wiping the back of her hand across her brow. "It's about time, don't you think?" Elaine smiled knowingly. "You've done more than you realize, Margaret. People needed someone to show them what was possible." Margaret glanced across the park where David was helping Mr. Thompson tighten the bolts on one of the picnic tables. Lily sat nearby with Jessica Brown and her children, carefully drawing colorful flowers and butterflies with chalk along the cracked pathway. The sight made Margaret pause, a wave of quiet pride swelling in her chest. "It wasn't just me," she said softly, her gaze lingering on David. "Sometimes you need someone to show you what you're missing." Elaine followed her gaze, her smile widening. "David and Lillian? They brought something special to Willow Creek, no doubt about that." Margaret didn't respond, but her heart agreed. By midday, the park was almost unrecognizable. The benches gleamed with fresh paint, vibrant flower beds lined the walkways, and the grassy areas had been cleared of weeds and debris. Neighbors gathered at the center of the park, sharing lemonade, sandwiches, and Margaret's oatmeal cookies, which had been a hit. Margaret sat on a newly painted bench, her hands resting in her lap as she watched the scene around her. Children ran and played, laughter ringing through the air. Parents chatted with one another, and older neighbors like Mr. Thompson looked on with quiet smiles of approval. David approached her, wiping his hands on a rag before sitting beside her. "Looks like we did it," he said, his tone light but filled with satisfaction. Margaret nodded, her gaze drifting across the park. "It's beautiful." "It is," David agreed, his eyes warm. And it's because of you, Margaret. You brought people together. You reminded them what it means to care about this community. Margaret turned to him, surprised by the weight of his words. Me? I didn't do this alone. David smiled faintly. Maybe not, but someone had to take the first step. Someone had to show the rest of us that change doesn't have to be a bad thing. Margaret looked down at her hands, feeling a mix of humility and pride. For a long time, I thought I was protecting Willow Creek by keeping things the same, by shutting people out. She paused, her voice soft. But I see now that I wasn't protecting it, I was holding it back. David nodded, his voice gentle. Sometimes we build walls to feel safe, but all it takes is a little kindness to break those walls down. Margaret let his words settle inside her. She glanced across the park, her gaze landing on Lily, who was showing off her chalk drawings to a group of giggling children. Margaret smiled faintly, her heart swelling with affection. Your daughter's going to grow up to be something special, she said softly. David chuckled, his eyes crinkling. She already is. As the afternoon light began to soften, Margaret found herself standing at the edge of the park, a small lavender bush in her hands. She had brought it from her garden that morning, unsure of what to do with it. Now, as she looked at the neatly restored space, she knew exactly where it belonged. She crouched near the corner of the park, where a small, empty patch of soil waited. Gently, she planted the lavender bush, pressing the earth around it with careful hands. Lavender. David's voice came from behind her, curious. Margaret looked up with a small smile. It's a symbol of peace and harmony. I thought it belonged here. David's smile was steady, his tone warm. It's perfect. Lily appeared beside them, her face flushed with excitement. Miss Margaret, look at the park. It's so pretty now. It is, Margaret agreed, standing and brushing her hands clean. You all did a wonderful job. Lily reached out and hugged Margaret around the waist, catching her off guard. Thank you for helping us, Lily said earnestly. Margaret froze for a moment, unsure of how to respond. Then, slowly, she placed a gentle hand on Lily's back, returning the hug. You're very welcome, Lily. As the day drew to a close, the neighborhood lingered in the park, reluctant to leave. David stood with Lily on the newly repaired picnic table, clapping his hands to get everyone's attention. Thank you all for coming together today, he called, his voice carrying across the park. This place looks incredible, and it's because of each and every one of you. I hope this is just the beginning of what we can accomplish as a community. There was a round of applause, cheers, and laughter. Margaret stood off to the side, watching quietly as neighbors smiled and exchanged words of gratitude. For the first time in years, Margaret felt truly part of something, not just a quiet observer, but a contributor to the life and warmth of Willow Creek. As the crowd began to disperse, David approached her once more. You did good today, Margaret. She looked at him, her eyes soft but steady. We all did. David nodded, smiling. It's a new beginning for the park, for this neighborhood, and maybe for us all. Margaret turned to look at the lavender bush she had planted, its small purple blooms swaying gently in the evening breeze. A plaque had been placed beside it, Lily's idea, a simple message carved into the wood. Open your heart. Unity begins with understanding. Margaret traced the words in her mind, feeling their truth resonate deeply. As she walked home that evening, the golden light fading into twilight, Margaret Cooper realized that change was not something to fear. It was something to embrace. And in the quiet of her heart, she knew that Willow Creek, her home, had never felt so alive.